Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Thanks for joining us. And this is the first in a series of webinars that are going to be covering this broad topic of carbon removals, taking carbon dioxide out of the sky and storing them somewhere safely and ideally permanently. So this is carbon removals, how to get them right. It's a partnership between Valence Solutions, my company, and the South Pole. And I'm Gabrielle Walker, and I'm going to be guiding you through the webinar today. Before we start, there's just a few housekeeping points. So there will be the default audio setting, which is mute on joining. You will all be muted, apart from me and the speakers. Please do put any questions in the question box if you'd like to at any time. We will try to answer them all, but if we don't get to your question today, we will get in touch later. And the session is going to be recorded and shared later with attendees. So with that out of the way, let me just say a little bit about this webinar. Really, it's part of a project sponsored by a large climate foundation, and we wanted to do it really as a curtain raiser for a whole series of events talking about this new and very important topic of carbon removals. There'll be more dialogues that we're curating at the TED Countdown event in Edinburgh in October, and we'll also be doing dialogues around the COP26, of course, and there'll be plenty of other conversations to follow about that, really because carbon removals are at the very beginning of their journey, which means that we do have still a chance to get them right. Now, the IPCC 1.5 degree report and many other scenarios have made it very clear that the science shows us that as well as reducing carbon emissions, we're also going to have to remove CO2 from the sky. And those two things are going to have to go hand in hand. And a bit later, we'll be talking about how to make sure that they complement each other, that they do go hand in hand rather than fighting. But before that, we're going to have a panel. We're going to talk about all the different ways that we can get carbon removals right, some of the biggest issues, some of the elephants in the room. But first, earlier I spoke to Nigel Topping, who is the UN high-level climate champion for COP26 from the UK. He couldn't join us today because he's in South Korea at the moment and he's already gone to bed, but I did speak to him earlier and he had some very interesting things to say about carbon removal. So here's what Nigel had to say. So Nigel Topping is the UN high-level climate action champion for COP26, and his role is to drive greater climate action from businesses, investors, cities and regions, and any other form of non-governmental organization, basically. Took the role in January 2020, and Nigel's team has launched the Race to Zero campaign, has published a series of near-term goals for each sector of the economy, mapping out what needs to happen to stay within 1.5 degrees. And there is one on carbon removals. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. But first of all, Nigel, just thank you very much for joining us. I know your schedule is crazy, so we really appreciate your time. Can you tell us briefly a bit more about your role? And with COP just around the corner, how are you feeling?
Well, I mean, you've described it really well. It's a big cat herding job, but I mean, I spend my time talking to CEOs and mayors and ministers and everybody, and a lot of it is about making sure that people understand the opportunity and the inevitability of change and the competitiveness risk if people don't embrace it, as well as the obvious, scientific and economic and human suffering risks if we don't tackle climate change. And a lot of that is about getting aligned at the next level of detail. You mentioned it, the breakthrough. So not just, yes, we need to get to 1.5 degrees. Yes, we need to get to net zero by 2050. Yes, we need to halve by 2030. But what does that mean more concretely for every actor in every sector of the economy? So a lot of what I'm doing with the team and with hundreds of partners is working on converging plans from multiple sectors and multiple actors around those pathways to zero in their particular economy, with a real focus on the short term.
Absolutely brilliant. We'll come to that in a little while, but first of all, so we're talking about keeping 1.5 degrees alive, and today's session is all about carbon removals, which hasn't really had a lot of attention in this whole game. So how do they fit into this whole 1.5 degrees net zero story?
Yeah, I guess the first thing to say is that, we're very much guided by the science, and I would say, and the economics that follows from the science, where we know that every fraction of a degree, every year counts, because we're talking about trillions of economic losses and billions of people affected badly by climate change. And the science tells us that we need to find ways to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, as well as doing everything we can to get to real zero wherever we can, because there are some residual processes that science doesn't think we'll be able to eliminate. So I think that's a really important point. We know that we need to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's not a nice to have, it's necessary to get to. I mean, the good news of the latest IPCC report is when we get to net zero, then temperature stabilizes, and then by then, because we've developed these removal techniques, we can continue to draw down. We can hopefully actually, in the second half of the century, actually correct back to something like where we've been in the rest of the last 10,000 years.
So, well, I think that's a really important point, because removals they bring these two things. One of them is to kind of turbocharge the efforts to get to net zero. And the answer is that we're going to need them. And the other is that they actually give us a chance of starting to reverse this whole process as well. So, I think we do need to get away from this kind of either or mitigation or removals, and realize that the role that they can play as a kind of both and, right?
Yeah. And I think an important point here is we're talking about here is removals. We're not talking about stopping emissions from getting to atmosphere, so-called carbon capture from point sources.
Yeah.
We're talking about carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere and taking it out of the atmosphere somehow. Of course, they're related technically, but we're talking about the net that gets us to net zero, the netting off bit, the minus to the positive that remains. We're not talking about the work that is going on to mitigate emissions that are continuing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the science is telling us something about the volume of removals we'll need even before 2050. Rough estimates?
Yeah, I mean, rough estimates are about 200 gigatons cumulatively, and obviously it's cumulative that's important. I mean, you can turn that into a curve, which we'll talk about later, will be an exponential curve. That's the IPCC. That's the figure derived by the Energy Transitions Commission from the IPCC. And that's a lot. We should talk a bit about how big that is compared to where we're at now.
It's an enormous number. So right now we're around the 3 million ton mark per year.
Yes, you tell me we're at 3 million tons, and to get to 200 gigatons, I mean, my rough math says we'd need to get up to about 10 gigatons per year. So we're at 3 million tons. So if you 30x that, you get to of 300x that, you get to 1 gigaton, and then we need to get to 10. So we need to 3,000x where we're at now. So that's a big. I mean, it's a typical exponential, but we're at the beginning of the exponential. We're going to need to double every couple of years. Normal Moore's law type for carbon carbon removal.
I think I really like the approach that you and your team have been taking. Have been looking at what we need by 2050, and so what we need to do now, and the kind of short-term targets on the way. And we've mentioned those earlier. So, and I do think there's a lot of new methods being developed potentially to draw down CO2, to do those carbon removals, but they're at a very early stage. So, it is going to be important to have shorter-term targets. And I know, tell me first of all a little bit about the targets that your team have been setting. Why do you think short-term targets are so important and good?
Well, I mean, a couple of reasons. One, I mean, the future, there's lots of uncertainties in the future. That's just a fact, right? And second is that most leaders, CEOs or mayors or ministers, really are looking at maybe a 5-year plan. I mean, it might be in the context of a 30-year strategy, but they're only making capital allocation decisions in R&D and new plant in the next 5 years. And so that's what we've got to play with, and that's what we've got to get right. And if we don't get the next 5 years right, then by 2030 we'll be off track. So that's one reason. The other reason is that we know that different technologies at very different stages of the typical technology adoption curve, which we know typically is an S curve, like takes a very long time because costs are high and people are reluctant. And then as deployment rises, costs come down and it goes exponential. And we're seeing that with renewable energy and with electric vehicles. I mean, electric vehicles were single digits a couple of years ago. They're now 30% in the UK. I mean, it's incredible, right, how fast that's going. That technology will completely take over within this decade because it's mature and very close to being cost competitive, i.e. electric vehicles will be cheaper than combustion engine cars in the next 3 or 4 years. And then it's game over, right? But with some of these earlier technologies like green hydrogen or like carbon removal, the costs are still very high because we're in an early stage of development. So it's not realistic to say that we're going to get to a third of the way to 10 gigatons in a third of the time. because it's exponential. So if we set unrealistic targets, we just get overwhelmed and give up. What we need to do is recognize historically that process of costs coming down, exponential deployment growth, and then set a target that's in line with a realistic interpretation of that history applied to this technology. That's how we get to the 100 million tons. So still, that's a lot. Like that's 33 times more than we're at now. So that's five double.
The 100 million tons is what you set for removals. So
100 million tons is our breakthrough target for the real economy in 2030. Like to be on track to that 200 gigatons cumulative by 2050, we need to ramp up by over 30 times from 3 million today to 100 million in 2030. That's 5 doubling. So that's doubling every 2 years, right? So 3, 6, 12, 24, 50, 48, 100. So that's the interim target, and it still seems low, like 100 million tons compared to still only 1% of the target for 2050. But it's just not, you can't think linearly in the early stages of technology. So you have to, and the exciting thing is that in the early phase, that feels sometimes like you're not being ambitious enough, but then you keep that doubling process and things take off. And that's familiar in our lifetimes, whether it's the internet or mobile telephony, as I say, now renewable energy, electric vehicles, all going exponential. So we just need to hold our nerve and be practical. But doubling the volume every 2 years is still aggressive, right?
I was just about to say that, because, you sort of, on the one hand, if you compare 100 million to 10 billion, then that seems like a low number. But if you compare 3 million to 100 million, you go, how the heck can we possibly go about doing that?
Exactly. It's the same with them in aviation. We've got a target of 10% sustainable aviation fuels in 2030. Again, that doesn't sound that ambitious, but in 2020, we're at 0.01. So that's 3,000x. That's right, 1,000 times. It's actually more because we expect the overall volumes will grow. So yeah, so that's why we're always looking at the relative increase rather than the absolute. Yeah.
So if you think about this then, so we're at 3 million tons now, we need to get to 100 million by 2030. That's a good target, and one that I hope a lot of people can get behind, knowing that the idea is that should go exponential. We need to start now and not wait till later. So I'm hearing this from you and from lots of other players as well. We need to get away from whether we should do removals to we know we're going to need them. How do we do them? How do we do them right? And how do we get them to scale fast enough that we can hit some of these targets? So any thoughts about how to get removals right, given that we have to do them?
Well, a couple of thoughts. First of all, given that we're at such early stage, we need to sort of enable lots of different approaches. I mean, that in particular between, if you like, nature-based and technical. So, we know that planting more trees done the right way will be part of the solution, but we also know, because of land use constraints and because they don't keep giving, right? I mean, once you've increased the biomass, then you reach equilibrium. So we can't rely on nature-based solutions only. And then I think, and actually, generally, there are other nature-based solutions which people talk about in terms of sequestering in soil, and there you start getting into some of the social concerns that we end up with, fuel versus food, or carbon versus food constraints. So I think you also need to think, I mean, especially as we start getting to scale, but it's worth thinking about these early on, about what the social dimensions of scaling up might be, and make sure that we're thinking about just transition and not ending up with a techno solution that actually ends up dumping on a whole part of the global community.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way I'm starting to feel like I'm getting a bit frustrated by the kind of nature versus tech mindset, because in a way almost all the solutions require some form of natural resources, and they also require some form of kind of technical ingenuity. Even planting trees and making sure you get them right, even the soils, everything, it's all a combination of the two. It's not really machines versus nature, it's actually both.
Yeah, and again, the scale of the challenge is so big that we really need to avoid wasting time arguing between options, and instead investing in all, because we don't know yet which ones will really deliver. I mean, people maybe have a bit more certainty about trees because it's an old technology, right? But as you said, but even so, trying to do things at the scale we're talking about is not an old technology. So I think we need to be careful we need to recognize that we need to embrace all possible solutions, because we need some redundancy in our plans, right? I mean, if we try and optimize at the level of our different ideas, we actually want ideas that get us 5 times as far as we get to if we all succeed, because we need to have some redundancy in our planning.
The way that I've been thinking about it a bit is we need the scale, we need the cost, we need the fairness, and we also need the permanence. We need to know that when the carbon comes out, it stays out. And it has been worrying me. Microsoft have been talking about this, that they actually invested in offsets of trees, and the trees in California then burned. And so it's how we can actually get the balance of everything, so that we can make sure we get the permanence, the scale, the cost, the fairness, and all of the solutions, all of the above, and some redundancy in there as well.
Yeah, and I think for me, the main thing is that we need to recognize that, because I think what carbon capture has got a bad reputation, because I think with some reason, it's been promised by a hydrocarbon industry as, in a rather hubristic way, like, we know what to do, you just need to pay us to do it and we'll do it. And nothing has happened, basically. We're at very, very low levels, and most of that is enhanced oil recovery. It's not. So I think, and it has been tended to be used as a rounding method to close the models to get us to zero. So there is a moral hazard in assuming how you get the negative bit that gets you to net zero. So I think that's a little bit of, there's a little bit of history in why some people are reluctant to talk about negative emissions, drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. But I think that's why we have to go back to the science, right? Yeah, yes, there is a moral hazard of, if we start assuming that we could do it all, we don't have to change anything, we can just suck the carbon out of the atmosphere, then there's a moral hazard there, because that's very unlikely to be true, and it means we wouldn't be making all the changes. That's why, in the race to zero, we're very, very clear that whenever we talk about negative emissions, it's always after the science-based reductions in actual emissions.
So it's after it, but in a way, what I'm hearing is that we need to make sure we do both. We need to make sure we get down as fast as we possibly can with the reductions. We also need to do the removals that the science is telling us we need. And quite importantly, you're saying that we need to start now. And we need to start now to be able to get the scale. And so it's not a kind of question of let's wait till later and see what we need, but it's getting everything on the table.
Well, no, like, as I say, if we've got to double the volume of CO2 that we're withdrawing from the atmosphere every 2 years, then if we wait 2 years, then we'll be much like, then the area under the curve will be much less by the time we get to 2050. So we start needing to increase the doubling rate. And it's just the other thing I think is that we need to start getting excited about this, right? Because this is another one of those moonshot things that when we realize we really got to do it, and we start putting the world's engineers and investors behind it, it's unbelievable. Again, Moore's law is the classic example, right? Which for decades now has kept on giving. It's not a physical law; it's an assertion of confidence in the ability of engineers. We, as engineers, will double the power of transistors every 18 months. So I say we, as engineers, as the world's investors and engineers, will double the amount of carbon removal every 2 years. We assert it and then we invest in it, and of course it's got an economic case as well. And as you say, the cost is too high now. But in 10 years, as we successfully halve the emissions in the atmosphere, but extreme weather continues to get worse, the economic value placed on carbon removals will definitely be higher than it is now by society, right? So the cost will come down and the perceived value will go up. So we'll get to the point where carbon removal projects are really in the money. And just like all the other mitigation efforts, they'll really start to be driven down, and we'll start to feel the benefit from them.
I love that message. And so, we're working with your team on a series of dialogues about carbon removals for exactly that reason. So we'll be talking about this and doing some work with your team at TED Countdown and at CARP, and we'll be carrying on the dialogues afterwards. But the final message that I heard from you is this isn't a time to be frightened of removals. This is a time to get excited about them and really put our heart and soul into them. And so with that thought, I just wanted to say we'd love to build on the target you've made, that 100 million tons, and get more people behind it and get concrete support from it. And just thanks again for making the time. And I know it's so crazy, but the most important message I've got for you, Nigel, is good luck. Your work could not be more important right now. I know it's exhausting. We are all rooting for you, and thank you for making the time just now.
Well, thank you so much. And I really look forward to carrying on. And just as we're speaking, I'm thinking, let's look to see, have we got enough projects in the pipeline to go from 3 million to 6 million in the next 2 years? That seems to be the question. And then in 2 years' time, when we say yes, have we got enough to get? That's the exponential mindset we need to have to making sure that we're on track all the way to 2050.
Okay, here's your exponential mindsets, and thanks very much, Nigel. Bye-bye now.
All right, thanks a lot, Gabrielle. Cheerio.
Well, we need to cultivate an exponential mindset and get excited, according to Nigel Topping. And I did really like the way that he was framing this, not as a if we should have it or if it's a nice to have, but something that's really essential. So how do we get it right? And that's what this conversation today is going to be all about. So I'm happy to say that we have a fantastic panel to help us unpick some of those issues that were raised in that conversation with Nigel. We're going to unpick that issue of social fairness, of levels of permanence, of how you can actually scale and get finance. And also we're going to look at the big elephant in the room of how you can make sure it really is both reductions and removals. And to help me unpick all of those, we've got these panelists who are now going to join us. So you're welcome now to come on in. We have Ugbad Kozar, who's the Deputy Director of Policy at Carbon 180, Eli Mitchell-Larson, who's an Associate of Oxford Net Zero and is also leading the charge in setting up an entirely new carbon removal advocacy organisation here in Europe. And we have Patrick Berge, who is co-founder and Innovation Director at South Pole. Welcome, everybody, and I'm looking forward to the conversation now. So let's start with this issue of social justice and fairness. This is something that I think is a really important issue. Nigel raised it, and I hear it a lot as well. Since we're starting at the very beginning with carbon removals, we're such an early stage, and this is one of the ways to get it right. What can we do? What can we do now to make sure that we can actually build social justice and climate equity into this whole story? Ugbad.
Yes, happy to dig into that. Thank you so much for having me here. So, as we mentioned, carbon removal is now a central tenet of climate action. We're seeing unprecedented funding and investment, growing interest in the public and the private sectors, and just a burgeoning discourse on how to scale up. Here in the US, where I am, the Biden administration has appointed several carbon removal leaders and experts to really head up some key offices. And Congress has shown a real bipartisan interest in both land and tech-based approaches. However, we can't really move to that next stage, or as Nigel said, that next level, without thinking about how to center equity and justice into our work. Thankfully, after a long uphill battle, environmental justice is starting to be recognized as a critical piece of that climate puzzle. There are so many reasons why this is important, but I'll stick to two in particular. One is we must make sure that nobody is left behind as we address climate change. And the second is embedding equity and justice is the most effective way to scale up carbon removal and to really get those projects off the ground. Climate action to date has been primarily focused on really mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, which is important, but it's completely ignored the fact that certain groups of people have been and continue to be disproportionately burdened by climate change and then harmed by policy decisions. So as a result, what we're seeing are rural and Black and Indigenous and other people of color. We're seeing low income, global South communities. They're all being impacted. Their conditions are being worsened. And these are groups where mothers are experiencing higher than average miscarriages or labor complications, where workers are presented with undignified or harmful working conditions, where Indigenous peoples are restricted from accessing their own lands, and where young children are playing alongside really harmful hazardous waste facilities. So I think this alone is motivation enough to change the status quo. But then we're also seeing some climate projects, again, Nigel mentioned carbon capture, for example, becoming stalled or canceled altogether because of that overwhelming opposition or that lack of societal acceptance. And so there are a lot of lessons to be learned that we can then use to apply to the carbon removal field, which unfortunately to date hasn't done a great job of thinking about this and could be on a similar path of maintaining some of those extractive relationships. But the exciting thing is, as we've mentioned, there is still an opportunity to impact the field and really shape it in a way that does integrate equity and justice. This is all great, but the question is, how do we do this?
Yes.
I think the first thing is important to understand, some of the different categories of the facets of environmental justice and the implications that it will have on carbon removal. So we start with that local environmental justice piece, honing in on really localized or community-based impacts and priorities. So we're thinking, air and water quality impacts, local job creation, how does that play with carbon removal? And then you scale up to that global environmental justice piece, right? This is a global issue, recognizing that many global north countries have contributed the most to emissions, and so have that capacity and the obligation to invest in and support carbon removal, and also global south countries grappling with this. And then the last one is a newer one for me, which is the intergenerational environmental justice piece. So it's recognizing that the actions that we take today will impact those future generations. So the more inaction that we have today, the more burden is going to be placed on those future generations. So how can carbon removal help mitigate that? Another thing to think about is, how do we address these different facets of justice? So you can think of, distributive or procedural impacts. So those distributive impacts are who benefits from carbon removal projects, where do those benefits flow, who inherits some of the burdens or harms, and then the procedural justice or the procedural impact. So how are decisions being made? How are projects chosen? How is input being implemented, and then later on influencing project deployment? And then ultimately, it's really finding ways to bridge gaps among environmental justice, among labor, among carbon removal advocates, all really important pieces of this. At Carbon 180, we're striving to really create a space for innovation and co-creation, which is key. And as I mentioned, what's exciting about carbon removal is there is that ample opportunity to shape it and what it's going to look like, but there's a need to better demonstrate some of the benefits that it can bring and the different approaches that we can take. So just circling back to my first point to wrap this up about getting carbon removal to that next level, we're going to need a broad group of people. This is a collective process, and we're going to make sure that we openly welcome environmental justice advocates to the table. And I think what's really important is we shouldn't view this as a roadblock or a hardship. I think this is a really great opportunity to get things right. And I'm genuinely excited, a little anxious, but very excited about where we're headed with this. So I think I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Ugbad, I think being excited and also a little anxious is probably the perfect way to be thinking about this whole area. It's kind of terrifying, but also thanks for this really interesting observations. And I think you raised more questions than you answered, which is the right thing to be doing at this early stage. And I think I really particularly love your point about making the connections between labour and social justice, people in the social justice movement and carbon removals advocates and the whole shebang. It is going to be crossing those great chasms that's going to help us get around this. Patrick, Eli, what do you think about what Ugbad said? And are you coming across similar kinds of ideas when you're thinking about removals?
Yeah, sure, I can jump in there. So yeah, I think at Carbon Removal Advocacy Europe, we're starting to look at the sort of pan-European context for removals. And I think a lot of the points that Ugbad raised aren't as much a part of the discussion around carbon removal in Europe yet. I think a lot of the conversations center around, well, the first point that Nigel raised, the moral hazard mitigation deterrence. Should we even be doing removals? It's kind of that basic argument. Then there's that next layer of my solutions versus your solutions. And I think that one thing that we want to provide is essentially that honest broker, that neutral platform where we can bring in the voices of these different groups, whether it's ENGOs that have perspectives that aren't reaching the highest levels of decision making, or groups that don't typically have a voice in these kinds of conversations. So I think, actually, to quote one of Ugbad's colleagues, Carbon 180 co-founder Gianna, essentially, we're going to get to a point where society will have to make decisions about which sets of solutions it wants to deploy. So there's going to be this sort of passing of the baton from the scientists and the technocrats to the decision makers who are supposed to be implementing the will of the people. And so they need to decide which solutions they'll deploy. And I think Gianna made the point that, with solar and wind, we learned to put solar where it's sunny and wind where it's windy. And we'll have the same learning process with the many different carbon removal pathways and techniques. And so for us, for Carbon Removal Advocacy Europe, in Europe, we want to actually start to have those conversations, build up that knowledge base, and then transmit that to decision makers so that they can start to make those more equitable and inclusive decisions about which solutions to deploy.
Patrick?
Yeah, I can comment a little bit on these different facets of the removals, because that's something that we are thinking about itself. We're already going into project level and assessing potential of reforestation versus soil carbon sequestration in agriculture versus engineered removals. And when I think about justice in the context of these different project types, I see different challenges emerging. So if I think of reforestation, for example, especially in the developing world, where I think the biggest potential would be, we have always issues around land tenure, but also how to involve the local communities. This potential conflict between food and planting trees could also be something that we saw already in the biofuels discussion in the past, and something that could emerge again. And in the biofuels discussion, thinking about biofuels in the context of carbon markets, that whole concern basically killed any progress around biofuels in carbon markets. I think rightly so, because the concerns were justified, but that just tells me we need to think early about these things and make sure we, as Akbat said, bring the people to the table to discuss these concerns and be quite open about it, and also constructive about solutions. And then when I think about the engineered removals, there I see quite a few parallels to CCS. And in the past, there was a lot of opposition by the NGO community to CCS. I think because of this moral hazard fear that CCS would be basically an excuse not to reduce carbon. And that, I think, could also play a role now in the engineered removals side. So also there, I think we need to engage early on and really hammer this message that Nigel mentioned at the beginning, that we need to do both in parallel. We don't have the luxury of arguing for 5 years, whether to do first reductions and then removals. We have to do both in parallel. And maybe the last quick thing.
Sorry,
go ahead.
We'll come back to the point about the moral hazard and the how we do both in a little bit. But I was also really intrigued by Ogbad's comment about the intergenerational justice issue. I hadn't really thought so much about that. I had been thinking about global south, global north, and also about how you actually make sure that this issue about bringing jobs, or about bringing other co-benefits to the local communities that will be hosting some of these removals. But the intergenerational point that in a way, removals are cleaning up our own mess. So there is an argument to say that we should be doing them now, if for no other reason that it's our mess. And otherwise, since we know the science tells us we have to have them, then we're just leaving them for our kids to clean up, which really does seem like entirely the wrong way around.
I mean, absolutely. I agree with everything that folks raised. And I think there is no real right answer to do this. I think there's a need to just better demonstrate what carbon removal can do, so that we can tie that back to, what communities are prioritizing right now and how carbon removal fits into that narrative. So there is more support for it. But I agree, Gabrielle, I think the intergenerational piece, yeah, really shocked me when I started really thinking about that, and just the fear that I have of, not working on carbon removal now and then having to do a really haphazard job in the future because we realize we actually need it, and that burden being placed on those future generations is not a great thought to have.
Well, thanks for that. So I want to move on now to the next big issue, which was raised by Nigel, and also we've had a question about it in the chat as well, about the point about really permanence. It's not enough just to capture the carbon. It's got to stay captured to some extent, and different solutions have different approaches to that, and different success in that. And so Eli, you're going to take this one for us. So give us an introduction to the whole issue of permanence and durability in removals. How do we get them right?
Sure. Yeah, and maybe just to kind of segue from some of the topics that Ogbad raised, I mean, I think this plays a role in the justice piece too, because carbon removal isn't just removal, it's actually removal and storage. You want to put the carbon in a safe location. And if that carbon is re-released or reversed, that's a new cleanup job for not necessarily even the next generation. It's really us in 10 years or us in 20 years. So sometimes there's this long distance thinking about generations, and other times we realize, the fortunes will be made, the lives will be lost. All of the issues we're talking about are going to happen in our lifetimes. So zooming into this issue of permanence and durability, I think when we talk about carbon removal, the quality of carbon removal and high quality carbon removal, We could talk about additionality, we could talk about indirect carbon leakage, we could talk about measurement issues. There's many components of quality. Permanence is an important one, and I think it's worth diving into. So I like that we're dedicating the time here. I think what's exciting about carbon removal is you can put carbon in lots of places. You can store carbon in trees, you can store it in soils, mineral formations both above and below ground. You can store carbon in the the buffer chemistry of the ocean itself, even in the built environment and long-lived products. So the array is sort of dazzling, and that's to Nigel's point about why carbon removal is exciting. There's all kinds of wacky ideas out there, and I think the three key questions you have to ask when we're talking about removals are, where can we store carbon? I've listed a few ideas. How much carbon can we fit in that place? Because some carbon stocks have more headroom, if you will, than others. And how long will the carbon stay there? And so I think all of those questions have to be asked. But even short duration carbon storage, even if you only store carbon for 10 years, you still generated value. You still kept a harmful pollutant out of the atmosphere. But the important thing to always anchor back on is, carbon is a cumulative pollutant. It's a pollutant that lives for a very, very, very long time in our atmosphere, ocean, biosphere system. And so the way in which we remediate it with removals, hopefully, has to be equally durable and permanent. And I want to bring in that distinction for a moment between permanence on the one hand and durability on the other. I think permanence implies this binary distinction. Either something is permanent or it's not permanent. And the reality is it's a little bit fuzzier than that. And I think durability, which refers to how resistant is this carbon that I've stored in a forest or in a mineral formation, how resistant is it to being re-released, to reversing back into the atmosphere? And it's that risk of reversal that we really want to try to limit. And I think there's a couple ways of ensuring that the carbon that we remove is stored in such a way that is, highly durable. I would say durability is sort of a characteristic of the different methods of removal. So it may be that storing carbons in soils is just a fundamentally less durable form of storage than storing carbon in mineral formations. Does not mean in any way that we should not pursue that carbon removal pathway. It just means it's different. But I think the two ways of thinking about it are, you can over remove. So you can remove more tons than you say you're removing, and you can basically create some sort of buffer pool or an insurance mechanism. And that's what we've seen in the conventional carbon markets. But I think another way of thinking about this that ties into the themes of equity and responsibility that I prefer actually in the way that I think about carbon removal, durability and permanence, is it's about stewardship. It's about the idea that when we remove, the nice thing about carbon removal is we remove the carbon, we store it, and we put it somewhere. We can say that carbon is in that structural beam in my house, or it's in that forest, or it's in that undersea geological reservoir, and we can watch it. So if we can appoint a steward, someone who's responsible for watching that carbon, that particular location of storage, and that person, and there's always someone on the hook to remediate the storage if it comes out. Because if no one's on the hook, then the carbon that we remove and store today is basically potentially teeing up future emissions that perhaps nobody will raise their hand and take responsibility for. So I think those are some elements and food for thought. The reality is this hasn't been settled. Groups like South Pole, like Puro, like Microsoft, Carbon Direct, all of these groups are jockeying to find the way to sort of package these products when they're packaged that way. And we're going to make a lot of progress in the coming years. So hopefully that's a useful introduction to this really exciting and interesting piece of the puzzle.
Super useful, Eli. And I like that idea of a steward, and also just really thinking about durability. It is a better way of talking about it than permanence, and does speak back to that point about intergenerational justice, right, Ogbad?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I love using the term durability as well. I think it just, especially when you're thinking about forests and agricultural fields, it just reflects the dynamic nature of carbon in those living systems, right? They're in a flux. It's just a matter of how can you better secure it for longer term, but it's not permanent. So I really do appreciate that. Something else that you brought up, Eli, the stewardship piece, someone needs to be on the hook. I think about that often when you think about full circle responsibility. So if you're going to have a project with geologic storage, who is responsible for monitoring for the next, I don't know, 1,000 years or however long it's going to be. And I think that really just taps into this bigger issue of regulations and this opportunity of shaping regulations in carbon removal and what that's going to look like. So really appreciate that. One last thing that ties it back to the justice piece too is oftentimes when I speak to different environmental justice advocates, they're a lot more open to the land-based side of carbon removal than they are technological CDR for a number of reasons. And so bringing this back to the idea of, we need all, and permanence or durability is an exact reason as to why we need tech to complement land-based approaches is really central to that conversation and sort of that knowledge sharing. So just really appreciate everything you mentioned, Eli.
We've had a comment which is buffer pools and stewardship need to be used together. This is yet another both and I think that's probably true. And also that carbon quantification needs to consider the length of time the carbon will be stored. Patrick, what do you think about this?
No, I also totally subscribe to what Eli mentioned, and I also myself I have to start changing maybe when we talk about permanence, we should maybe change not to the term durability. And one, I think, important consideration from my side is thinking about markets, but also regulation, incentives by governments. At the end of the day, we'll need to be able to do accounting around removals. And this is where this concept of durability comes in and becomes very crucial, right? We need to be able to compare different removals. And some, for example, if you think of agriculture, they are great for soil health, improve also water retention, so they have great benefits. However, when it comes to permanence or durability, they have some issues, right? And there are many standards thinking about, guaranteeing permanence or durability for 10 years for soil carbon. But if you think about geological storage, that could be a different piece, right? But if you think then of a market price for these things, we should factor in these reversal risks or a certain period of durability, right? So if we could agree, for example, on 100 years durability as the norm, and then, if a soil carbon removal unit lasts only for 10 years, you need to buy that unit 10 times over 100 years. But with geological storage, you may need only one. Or with forests, that the way carbon markets are approaching that is more based on a risk assessment related to a specific location, right? So you can think of the risk of forest fires and that being very specific to a region. So I think there are different ways to approach it, but we will need soon to agree, I think, on how to standardize this and make these things comparable. Otherwise, the market won't scale.
Sure. There was a question, any opinion about the ton-year approach as an alternative to do this? And that sounds like, is that what you were describing just then, Patrick? I'm not sure what the ton-year approach is, but it sounds a bit like what you were just saying.
Yeah, there are different approaches, but Eli, I think I'll let him comment on this one.
I saw you nodding, so.
Yeah, so the ton-year approach is actually a very old approach. It was in the early 2000s, the idea of sort of accounting for tons stored for a certain number of years versus a permanent ton was described in some of the UN documentation. And a company called NCX has recently, that's sold to Microsoft in their first procurement, has actually been advancing, not for removals, but for avoided emissions, the idea of ton years. I think it's interesting. I think that the trick is that companies, that want to buy carbon removal credits, or hopefully soon governments, right? We think of Jen Wilcox in the US, and we hope that she'll succeed in getting, carbon removal procurement from the US government. But anyone who's buying these credits, they want to be able to wash their hands and say, I bought the credit, it one-for-one neutralized this specific emission that I had, and I'm done. That's what they want to be able to say. And the thing about ton years is you have to realize that's not how they work. You could store 1 ton of carbon for 1 year and then store another ton of carbon for 1 year, and you keep doing that into perpetuity. But there's this great temptation to convert ton years into tons, which if you think about it for a minute, you say, wait a minute, how is that possible? And I won't go into how NCX and others do it, but the point is that's a really slippery slope. And I think it does, though, highlight this point that I was making, which is you can store carbon, but there's always got to be someone on the hook. And that's the same for soils, forests, and geological storage. We look at geological storage and we say, oh dear, we're going to have to monitor that in perpetuity. But the same applies to a forest. And if the forest, if conditions change and the forest decreases its carbon stock, that's fine. But someone, whether it's the developer or the government at some point, because we have to recognize that a lot of these liabilities will have to be handed over to the people They can't be held on the balance sheet of an organization forever. But someone someday will remediate that reversal by putting an equal amount of carbon back in. So I think if we think of it in simple terms, what comes out must go down. We just have to balance sources and sinks. And I think ton years are an interesting approach, but I struggle to see how we'll be able to slow the temptation to make these conversions between permanent tons and ton years.
We also, in the conversation with Nigel, started to touch on this, and it's come up again, the kind of, it's almost like a tech versus nature versus solutions versus engineered. And yet, in the topic of durability, I'm now learning to call it, and we've had a few shout outs from in the chat, by the way. People are enjoying the term durability. It's a nice one, Eli. One of the things I was thinking is that in many cases, technology can actually help make natural solutions more durable. So that you already mentioned like building materials, and so you've got beautiful wood in your house that stays, and that's a kind of engineering plus nature solution. And also solutions like biochar, where you're taking, and I only discovered recently, this is actually indigenous wisdom made bold. It's indigenous people in the Amazon have been using biochar to enrich their soil for a really long time. And now, so biochar, the idea is to take wood, and instead of letting it rot, pyrolyze it, burn it without oxygen, so then it becomes something that can't give up its carbon, and then use that to enrich soils. That's technology and nature sort of going in hand to help increase the durability of that wood. I'm just thinking a lot of nods here.
I also think with nature, I mean, there's still like human intervention involved, so there is still that amount, right? Like, it's not like you're just leaving nature to do its thing. Like, regardless, there is that intervention. So even that dichotomy doesn't always make sense when you think about it in that way.
Exactly. I think, Gabrielle, you mentioned how you don't always like this, or with Nigel, that you don't like this nature versus tech distinction. And I agree with what Ugbad said, which is that, we can separate carbon removal and storage into the instance of removal and the instance of storage. And the removal piece can be nature mediated, I would say. Like, plants are helping us with photosynthesis take those CO2 molecules. Like, thank you, plants. And in other situations, we'll use geochemical processes. So the type of capture can be divorced from the type of storage, because you might use nature to take the CO2 out of the air, but then you might combust it into, as you mentioned, a pyrolyzed biofuel, or you might generate energy and store pure CO2 in a geological reservoir where it can remineralize with the earth over time. So I think the nature versus tech distinction is overplayed. I agree. And really, like, what is anthropogenic, right? What is caused by people? It's easy when we see Climeworks opening their plant in Iceland. We can say, humans did that. It's a little harder to say which removals are anthropogenic when it comes to forests and soils, because nature's doing a lot of stuff on its own, against all odds, against all the weapons we're pushing against it. It's doing a lot of removals on its own. And so those, we can't count those as our removals. Those are, nature provided them. So that anthropogenic, non-anthropogenic distinction is also a little tricky.
Sure. Well, so just one last quick comment on durability before we move on to the next one, but very quick if we can. It's just we've had the question about international law. It's basically international law tends to sort of trail along behind and isn't necessarily consistent from country to country. So if you're thinking about how to make storage durable, how can you actually handle that in the context of the complex sort of interplay between different countries and their legal frameworks?
Yeah, maybe I can comment on this one. I think we alluded, I think Eli alluded to this in his last comment. So I think we need to really, when we think about removals, we have to distinguish between capture and then CO2 transport, actually moving from the capture side to the storage side, and then you have storage. And the interesting thing about removals is that, we need systems thinking, and you may have a combination of multiple storage technologies or nature-based solutions, different ways to transport CO2, and many ways to store CO2, as Eli mentioned. And storage sites, good storage sites, might not be available everywhere. So I'm in Switzerland, for example, and there is no good storage site. There is some theoretical potential, but nothing I think that will happen in the short term. So if the Swiss want to generate negative emissions, taking biogenic CO2 from their wastewater treatment plants or incineration, they will have to ship this to another country like Norway or Iceland. And then, can you transport CO2 across borders? Right? It becomes almost like a waste handling issue. So there are precedents to that in terms of international regulation. And the EU is working on something like that through the 10E regulation. but it's, yeah, there are many uncertainties. And then there is this need for cross-border infrastructure, especially when you think about transport. So we may need pipelines of CO2. In the US, this is actually quite advanced already because it might be easier. If you think of Europe and the regulatory mess that we'll have, thinking of a pipeline going all the way from Switzerland to the North Sea in Holland, crossing 3 countries on its way, that will be a challenge, right? So, but yeah, regulation will be key to solve some of these issues. And then we have also the issue of accounting at Paris Agreement level. So if Switzerland exports CO2 to Norway for storage there, how much can be counted towards the Swiss NDC, how much is Norway's NDC, and so on. So it's interesting.
So these are, I think in all of these points, we're raising a lot of questions and putting them on the table. And I think in the conversations that follow this one and the dialogues that follow, a part of the game is going to be to really examine them, look at them, try and understand the implications. But we've had a question. I would like to hear the panelists discuss how to make removals economic. What are the mechanisms, practical or idealistic, by which we create economic incentives for removal? Which brings me very neatly to your topic, Patrick, which is how do we scale removals? How do we get the finance to them? So do you want to introduce that for us?
Sure. I came up with 3 main things, 3 main ingredients on how to scale removals. And I think we probably need a lot more, but from my point of view, I think these are 3 key ones. First one is standardization. Second one is revenue certainty. And the third one is policy and regulation. And I'll go into each one of these. On standardization, I think we touched on a couple of things, but if we want to include removals in climate strategies in a meaningful and credible way, we will need to work on things like basic things like what's the definition of a removal versus an avoided emission, right? And there is even confusion today out there about these very basics. Then another example, what's the definition of permanence and durability? Are we talking 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? Then we need accounting rules, right, to make sure that if you think of a system where there are different players involved in capturing, transporting, and storing, who can claim the credit for that removal? How are these removals used in accounting at international level or even corporate level? So these are things, some of the basics that we need to get right in terms of standardization. And we started an initiative a few months ago called the CCS Plus initiative, which tackles these questions around the engineered removals. Because I think in order to get things, make them economical and scale, we need to be able to account for these things. And carbon standards didn't have methodologies for engineered removals, and that's what the CCS Plus initiative is doing. On the second point, revenue certainty. If you think back to renewables back in the day, why did we manage to scale renewables and bring the cost down? That was because these technologies had revenue certainty. Right? So we had the German government, the Japanese government stepping in with feed-in tariffs, which were above the current, the electricity price at that time. And that gave investors and tech providers the investment certainty to, start developing technologies and improving them over time. I think we need something similar for removals. And we see some demand coming up in voluntary markets. South Pole is also working on that through our carbon removal purchase facility with Mitsubishi Corporation. But it's also clear the voluntary markets are maybe a good starting point and a bit of a test bed, but eventually we'll need governments to step in and create a really big demand and pull for these technologies. That's, I think, a key one.
Third one, Patrick, can I just unpick that for a moment, the advanced purchase facilities, because I've been hearing this from quite a few different groups that are trying to do a similar thing to what you're doing with the Mitsubishi Corporation, which is pool advanced purchase, saying we will buy your removal certificate, so you have a guaranteed revenue, and that means that you can do the project financing. You can borrow against that to make the project actually happen. And I think it's kind of ironic because in a way at the moment there's much more demand for removals than there is supply. And this is an approach to say we've got too much demand, not enough supply, so let's make more demand. But the reason to make more demand is so that you can then actually generate the financial certainty that will allow more supply, right?
Yeah, I think there is indeed in the market right now there is more demand for removals than supply, and the supply that is there comes from mainly reforestation projects. But also there, I think the low-hanging fruits are gone, and there is a mismatch in market prices today versus the cost of, let's say, good reforestation projects based on native species that take biodiversity into consideration and all those things, right? So we will need revenue certainty at the right price level, and this is where we have the big mismatch, and that mismatch is much bigger for the technological removals, where carbon markets today are, the voluntary markets, still in the average of $5 per ton, whereas most engineered removals are $100 per ton and above, right? So there is this huge gap, and there is, I think, a lot of wishful thinking about companies in the voluntary market today, wishing, to go net zero with a lot of removals at a cheap cost. Many companies still have internal carbon prices of, I don't know, $15 per ton, $20 per ton. And I think, we'll need to rethink that and set the right price levels going forward. So it's not just about demand supply, but revenue certainty at the right cost, right? And eventually the cost will come down for the engineered removals. But today, the tech developers, they need a premium price to get going.
So just any comments on that by Eli and Ugbad before we move on to your third point?
Yeah, I did want to jump in briefly. I mean, I couldn't agree more but I just want to double down on something that Patrick did in fact say, but just kind of to reemphasize it, which is that, and this is at Carbon Removal Advocacy Europe, we're focused on this journey from early R&D support. So without government funds, we just don't think this journey can happen, right? If we put all our bets on the voluntary carbon market, we're really in for one. And I think it's about increasing those R&D budgets for the technologies that are still nascent. And this is where Europe can play a huge role. That's why we're launching this organization, to say, this is an opportunity for European governments. Europe needs CDR to meet its net zero goals and to fulfill its historical responsibility for having warmed the planet. But CDR needs Europe. We don't think that these technologies can get down.
I'm going to jump in.
R&D budgets and then deployment incentives and standards. It's all those pieces, I think, in sequence.
So just making the point that CDR is actually carbon dioxide removal. We let a three-letter acronym sneak in there.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I agree. I'm thinking a lot about just the purchasing power of like the U.S. federal government, and with direct procurement, even buying it at $600 a ton right now can really help drop that cost curve. So how can we ensure that the federal government is doing its job both with the R&D, but also thinking about direct procurement and the possibility that's there?
Sure. So Patrick, your third point.
Yeah, on the third one, to wrap it up before the Q&A session. So the third one was on policy and regulation. And as I mentioned before, I think without government action, we won't get to the scale that we need quickly enough. We'll repeat, I think voluntary carbon markets are an interesting test bed, maybe an early mover in this space, but we will need government action and policy and regulation in the long run. Looking at the COP in Glasgow, right? Article 6 will be, I think, an important puzzle piece that can govern also some of these international transfer and cross-border removal projects.
So Article 6 is?
Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the article that governs international markets for carbon, basically international carbon markets, put in very simple terms. Yeah. And that is, the governments couldn't agree on this. So that's one of the big gaps that's still missing in terms of a rule book at Paris Agreement level. And everyone is hoping that Glasgow will deliver this. So let's fingers crossed on that one. But yeah, I think regulations, policy and regulation will be important to address certain safeguards. I think going back to Ugbad's points around justice, but yeah, we will need also very basic regulation around CO2 transport and infrastructure, as already mentioned before, because these are typical things that it will be difficult for a private sector actor basically to construct and own and operate a pipeline without any in a vacuum, so that won't happen. So this is, I think, also where governments will need to step in. Yeah, and that's, I think, that's it all.
I think maybe for all of us, because it's maybe a slightly controversial point for this group, which is the question that we're addressing now is, how do you get carbon removals to scale? And I was really struck by the way Nigel Topping was saying we need an exponential mindset. How many projects do we have? How many do we need? We've got doubling. We need 5 doublings before 2030. So let's get on with it. And that's a kind of moonshot mindset. We've got a target. We need to get there. Do we have enough? If not, let's get it. And that's one mindset. And another one he mentioned was, he said we should be excited about removals. And I'm not feeling that excitement from people on a panel who I know are excited about this. So I'm just going to chuck some in there, because I would argue that the biggest thing it's going to take to get removals to be socially just, to make sure that we can have the right levels of permanence, and also to make sure we can drive finance and scale them, is a mindset change, is a narrative change, if you like. And the biggest issue that I keep on encountering, and I'm sure you have, and we've had it brought up a couple of times in the questions as well, is what I referred to at the beginning, the moral hazard. What if investing in removals means that you're not investing in reductions? What if this gives people an excuse? What if removals are just used to say, let's carry on burning coal, let's carry on pulling oil out of the ground, and oh, it's all right, we can do it all with removals. How do we get around that issue, the fundamental moral hazard that says we shouldn't even touch them in case it ruins everything? And I need the answer to be solved within the next 5-10 minutes, so that we can then all go away and go home and not worry about it anymore.
Yeah, I have a few ideas I could share, but yeah, one would just be, I can't agree with you more, Gabrielle, about this sort of risk of infighting. And I think the moral hazard argument is maybe a form of infighting, because we should remember that the moral hazard, meaning the promise of some future technological change is going to distract us from current action, it applies to everything. And this is something that Robert Hoagland, who I recommend everyone try reading, he's writes some great stuff on carbon removal online. He made me aware of this, that if somebody tells me there's going to be some incredible electric vehicle that's going to cost very, very little, that could generate a moral hazard too. It's not exclusive to carbon removal. And so what I really think this is, these are legitimate concerns, and they've been raised for decades, really. But what I really think this is a form of kind of scarcity mindset, which is an expansion of Gabrielle's point. I think a lot of us who have been working in climate for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, we're used to fighting for anyone to pay attention that this is the greatest challenge we've ever faced as a species. And we have to sort of turn a corner and realize, for the moment, the zeitgeist has changed. We're charging over the hill, and the enemy's in retreat, and the pie can get bigger. It's not so much about fighting for scraps of the pie, it's about growing the pie. So we can have much more money for avoided deforestation and removals. We can have both of those things. We don't have to think, oh, wow, the money that's going to go towards forestation is going to sap money that goes to avoided deforestation. Both can happen. In fact, they have to, because the two counteract each other. And then the last piece, I think, is that removals can actually motivate faster reductions. Everyone's fixated on this idea that the promise of removals makes us less ready to act now. But look at Swiss Re, right? They committed to a $100 internal price, $100 per ton to buy carbon removal. That's a very, very high price. They have lots of opportunities to reduce their emissions for cheaper than $100. And you better believe they're going to do it, because they don't want to pay $100 if they don't have to. So they basically just tied their own hands and said, we're using very high quality removals as a driving force to get us to change our business completely. So the two things communicate. They're not at odds necessarily. That said, I think we have to watch out for the kind of wishful thinking. And I have had a few experiences where I introduce somebody to the idea of carbon removal, and they say, oh, wow, that's great. So we can just, so there is that mindset that some people have, and we have to watch out for that. But I think generally speaking, the two can complement each other.
Beth?
I agree. I think there's just a need to find how they can support one another. I mean, I think about avoided emissions. So you're thinking about managing forests for wildfires, and you have thinnings, and you have underbrush management. What do you do with that afterwards, like the forest residue? Well, there's a pathway that you can use with bioenergy, with carbon capture storage, and then you turn it into net negative products or fuels, or it's stored underground. And so they're working together, and I think that's what we need to think about, is that systems piece. And I also agree. I mean, we just need a lot more investment overall with all climate action pieces across the board, and both with carbon removals, both with emissions reductions. I think there's just a real need to work together, and just making sure that we are emphasizing that yes, like we need removals, but we also do need very aggressive emissions reductions, and we're not countering one versus the other, but we're working in harmony. So I think that's a really important piece to just keep driving home to folks, that we can do both and find systems where you have renewable energies that are also supporting direct air capture plants, or just thinking about it in a more systemic, like holistic way.
Sure. I mean, I think it's interesting that when you think about how we got to some of the renewable energy targets in Europe, there were actually separate targets for renewable electricity, regardless of the emissions. It's just like, we're going to have this percentage of renewable electricity regardless, so that we can get this whole technology going. And I think at the moment there are some tentative suggestions that there could be separate targets for removals and for reductions, but almost for the opposite reason. It's like, we don't want too many removals so people don't get away with just keeping on with business as usual. But I think it is a good approach to say, okay, we know we need to get to 100 megatons by 2030. We know we're at 3 now, so we need to do this doubling. So let's have this target. Separately, we know that by 2030 we need to halve our emissions. We know what we're doing at the moment, so let's have these targets and let's make sure that they work in parallel. And I don't quite understand why we can't do that. In fact, I think we can. Patrick, you were nodding most emphatically. What do you think? How can we handle this issue?
No, I totally agree, and this goes back to my first point on standardization, right? And accounting rules. I think that's absolutely key. And I think no matter how we do this, as long as we are, there is transparency in the system, and we can see how much governments are doing to reduce emissions, how much they're doing in terms of removals, and if they're more transparent, both in terms of targets and how they're doing to achieve this, without conflating everything in one, net figure. I think we will learn so much more from it. So I think transparency is key, and I think if you think of the voluntary markets and corporate disclosure, we have come a long way, with carbon footprints disclosure by companies. The foundations are all there, and I think the GHG protocol, for example, is already working on new guidance around how to account for removals. So I think if we get the accounting rules right, and then we have public disclosure, then it's also easier to hold companies, governments accountable, for their targets. But I think transparency is key, and I would definitely support that. But I think it's super important.
Sure. So we've had quite a few questions around the general issue of how you can. We've been talking about bundling together kind of nature-based solutions and engineering solutions, and how you can actually bundle them, how you can, you spoke earlier very powerfully about, you can store carbon here, you can store it there, you can store it in the oceans, it can be in the trees, it can be in buildings. And so I think there's a question about, what does that even look like if you're starting to see that as a bundle, as a package, as a kind of system rather than as individual technologies? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I guess it just depends on where you are deploying these projects. Like, there's going to be possibilities where, for example, if you have a direct air capture plant, is there a way that it can be integrated into a public park system? So like a more modular sense of it. So you're still having access to open space, but then you're also removing at the same time. I mean, that's a very one version of what direct air capture could look like, but thinking a little bit more about integrating it into the day-to-day lives so people are more familiar with them. When we think about forestation, it's not just rural, out there spaces, but there's also, urban tree planting that can happen that's in your backyard, and how is that going to be combined with like urban agricultural spaces? So just getting a little bit more familiar with the different ways you can do carbon removal both on land and tech, but trying to find really cool ways where people can just feel more familiar with these technologies or with these approaches, and then how they can be used with one another. But the direct air capture one in particular is one I was pretty fascinated by.
So I've been thinking about this in summary. We have been trying to think about what it takes to do removals right. It's not if, but how, and who, and where, and what it's going to take. And I think we've raised a lot of questions and put them on the table. As I said earlier, we are going to be having more dialogues like this, where we're going to tease apart some of these things in more detail, and look at who needs to be part of the conversations as well. And I'm going back to something that you said at the beginning, Ugbad, about how we need to broker, and in fact, Eli, you mentioned this too, broker conversations between the people who are saying it has to be this or that. And I do think that in the whole climate game, that the kind of my solution, not yours, has been a real damage to our chances of success. And obviously we have to make choices, obviously there are trade-offs, but right now it feels like with this nascent technology, this nascent approach, I wouldn't even say technology, it really is about cultivating these three things I wrote down: the exponential mindset. So we need to get doubling and then another doubling, another doubling. How do we do it? The abundance mindset, which is the, we're not actually scrabbling for small pieces of the pie, but the world has actually realized we need all of this. And so now we can actually look at how to drive the money there. And that's systems mindset, which is thinking about how a national park fits with direct air capture, or how offcuts from trees can also be used in an engineered way to store carbon. It's a different way of thinking about this. And if we think this way, it's much harder for there to be that moral hazard, that this is a way to take attention away from reductions. It becomes part of the package. I remember when I've been working on climate change for a long time, and I remember when a similar argument as to this moral hazard was made about adaptation. It was sort of saying, you can't talk about adaptation because then that's giving up. If you talk about adaptation, then they'll stop people from working on mitigation. And eventually we realized that we have to adapt. Climate change is already with us, and we have to try and stop it getting worse. What was that brilliant phrase that John Holdren used, which was, it was we have to manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable. So we have to do both. And I'm just thinking, it feels a bit like that kind of thinking now also applies to reductions and removals. We obviously need both. Let's try and get away from fighting between them.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last couple of minutes of this, thank you very much for a rich and interesting discussion. I'm going to ask you just one quick question each to finish up with. We put a lot of questions on the table, lots of things that we're trying to answer. If there's one thing that you could have that you feel would make the big difference with really getting removals up to scale fast enough, fairly enough, and cheaply enough, what would it be? Patrick, starting with you.
Just one thing. I had three, so I have to cut two off from my list. But I think at the moment, I would go with revenue certainty, because at the moment we see a lot of talk, but when it comes to willingness to pay and people really putting some money on the table and paying a premium price for either deforestation done in the right way or engineered solutions, I think that we can still do a lot in this space.
The revenue certainty. Eli.
I think for us, it would really be engagement by Europe. So we think, carbon removal isn't just something that people can profit from. It's not just something that, that people need. It's something the planet needs. And we think that's something that the European Commission and the European governments are just sort of waking up to. And so for our organization, we're really focused on, how can we get governments, specifically the European governments, who have the political will to actually bring these solutions to light, the long-term sustained deployment incentives that they need to bring their costs down. So we're hoping that people will listen, people will be open to forming new coalitions of people that actually see the need for carbon removal from the perspective of the planet. So that's why we're exclusively philanthropically funded, so that we can say we're really just doing this because we see the need for carbon removal. So if you're interested, check us out, cdradvocacy.org. But yeah, I think for us at the moment, it's we have some engagement in North America, thanks in large part to the great work of Carbon 180 and others. And this ultimately is a global challenge, but I think it's time for Europe to step up to the plate, and it's starting to when it comes to this not new, but important theme, carbon removal.
Nogvad?
One thing, I would say a really great case study with a large-scale deployment, direct air capture, something where we've had really robust engagement, where we've been able to show all the benefits that carbon removal can bring, and then use that case study to be replicated for other projects. I think we're just missing that one really great example that can be used. So that would have a really big impact, I think, on that societal acceptance piece that I was talking about.
Show it happening on the ground. And so, and I'll use the moderator's privilege to do the last one thing that I would like, which is a shift in the mindset, that many more people who have such powerful roles to play in actually solving this climate crisis actually get excited about the possibilities of removals and get these exponential mindset, abundance mindset, and systems mindset really going. And I think if we do that, we'll make our targets and we really can help to save the world. Thank you very much indeed for all of your contributions. Thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks for fantastic questions. And we will be in touch with you afterwards with what we heard and to continue these conversations. Thanks very much. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.